Hello, everybody. Welcome to this series of 360 Leadership. And I'm very happy to have two very senior executives joining us today, sharing with us their experience, their observations, and some of the things that different professionals have done successfully to navigate this complex world. Let me just quickly introduce the first panelist, Mr. Na Boon Chong. Mr. Na has been working in the Aeon Human Capital Solutions for the last few years, and his experience are very strong in terms of his corporate governance, organizational transformation, enterprise performance management, and other critical HR policies. He's a practice leader in corporate restructuring and change, and it's so exciting to have him today because I feel like, being involved in some of this consulting work is going to help give us insights into what some organization has done really well and what some professionals has expertly done to navigate this complex world. We've got Prof Nigel with us as well. Prof Nigel is an associate professor with Nanyang Business School, and he's teaching in the Division of Strategy, Management and Organization. And prior to that, he's also a practitioner, a senior leader that's been a managing director of CEB and many senior roles across the region. He also has been very involved in doing senior executive assessment and placing them into critical roles, especially working in large organizations in terms of helping organization identify their high po and assessing them and placing them in this sort of complex, to help the organization to grow. So I'm very excited to have both of them join me today. Quick introduction of myself. I'm a mother of 3 kids, and I run the talent and learning solutions for LinkedIn across Asia-Pac. So today we are joined by these two wonderful gentlemen, and the title of this webinar is 360 Leadership. Maybe quickly, I can just ask Boon Chong and Prof Nigel to give us a quick overview of what you believe is the meaning of 360 leadership and why is it so important? Can I start with Mr. Na Boon Chong?
Sure. I'm coming across okay? That's the volume?
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Before Boon Chong, before you go, can I encourage all the audience to stay engaged, and so please ask any question along the way so that you can keep this conversation going. I'll make sure we've got people that is helping us to organize the questions as well, and we can keep it free flowing. All right, over to you, Mr. Na.
Thank you. Yeah, I think first of all, I think there are as many leadership models as there are leadership experts and researchers. Being a practitioner, I'm agnostic to any specific model. If I were to look at practices in organizations, 360-degree feedback is a common feature or common technique to develop employees, also as a part of performance management. So to answer your question, I would gather that 360-degree leadership is about looking at yourself as a leader from all around, starting with what you are as an individual, have a better understanding of yourself and how you change and grow. The second point would be how your direct reports see you after you become a people manager. And third point, how your peers work with you or choose not to work with you. Fourth point, how your higher ups assess you, and not just your immediate manager, but other senior management as well, since today's organizations are very much collaborative working, not necessarily following the unity of command. I think the last point that I have would be that for senior leaders is about how the public sees you as well. As CEOs is often the public face to the world out there. With all this feedback from all around, then it's about how you could improve yourself based on the feedback to progress in your career.
That's really interesting. Thank you very much. I probably have a few questions that I'll probe, but before I go there, I'll let Prof Nigel share with us your perspective.
Sure,
Prof, over
thank you.
to you.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to be at this platform to share my opinion about this topic. And so thank you very much, Fion, for inviting me. So to respond to your question, what is 360 leadership? I guess, first of all, we need to kind of understand what is leadership. In my personal opinion, leadership doesn't have to be in a formal appointment. Certainly, anybody in the organization can take on the role of being a leader. So leadership is actually a social influence process to maximize the efforts of people to achieve a common goal. So if you look at this kind of definition or statement, then really anybody who really have a passion or strongly believe in a certain common objective, anyone can be in that positions. So then the question is then why 360? I guess 360, you can look at it from both ways. One is a very commonly used tool, like I think Boon Chuan just mentioned, the 360 feedback tool, which nowadays many organizations deploy such a tool. I guess the underlying objective is really to enhance self-awareness, to increase the personal insight, with the assumption, and that's a really big assumption, that the individual will be able to take this insight and then change or try to kind of enhance personal effectiveness. But again, we will never know, right? So how people process the information, whether they accept, that will be another topic we can talk about later on. But then also, I guess the other part to look at 360, as what Boon Chuan mentioned, is that being a leader, you don't just lead your so-called followers or your team, but also able to engage multiple stakeholders, be it lateral, your top management, but also external stakeholders as well, right? So the 360 is really all-encompassing. What is more important to me personally is at the core of the 360 is the self, right? The individual. So I guess in some literature, we talk about the self-leadership, right? The leadership efficacy, right? Do you have the confidence to be a leader? I think that's one of the most fundamental areas that one needs to ascertain or confirm.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the word assuming that someone has the ability to draw the insight and make the changes. What do you think are some of the stumbling blocks that stop people from rising to the next level? Boon Chuan, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think if you look at career stages, the fresh graduates coming in, they are starting their career is pretty much learning about the content, whatever the knowledge part of things, and the whatever jobs that they're doing, they're learning about the content. Then they need to learn fast, reflect, apply, etc. I think some of the stumbling blocks is that a lot of times our success, we are very good at doing certain things, but that may not guarantee the future success. For example, if I'm a very good engineer and I continue to progress up the engineering career path, but I might have neglected certain aspects, certain requirements at a higher level. If we look at, let's say, a square itself, if we cut a diagonal line across, the first half of the square is the content knowledge. And you look at from the junior level, there's a lot of content training is needed. People need to learn the depth and then the breadth as they progress up the hierarchy. And the other half of the square is more of the soft skills, relationship skills, etc. As you progress up the organization, that part is going to increase in terms of importance. I think some of the stumbling block might be, I'm so caught up in doing what I'm doing, and I'm very good at doing what I'm doing. I might have neglected some of the requirements at different levels.
Nigel, what's your thoughts on that?
I suppose when you ask that question, I assume you're talking about, if an organization appoints someone as a leader and the leader does not perform and so on. So what kind of causes it for the leader not being so successful? I guess we have to kind of look at it both ways. we cannot kind of squarely look at it that this leader is not able to perform, but also in the process of the selection, right? How the organization actually select a good fit, a person organization fit is certainly quite important. And we can actually look at companies in the past that actually appointed senior leaders based on the person's past successful track record and assume that the person is able to then take on this role successfully. So a good example I can think of is, for example, in the US, JCPenney, way back in 2014, I believe, where they appointed this former Apple senior executive, Ron Johnson. And he was very famous at that time because of his ability to set up the Apple iStores and so on. But then, you know, when he took on the role in JCPenney, it kind of feel quite miserably, right? So that kind of bring us to attention that sometimes how we appoint leader is quite important. The second area I would say is that is about personal self-awareness, as I mentioned earlier on. As a leader, we know that the role of a leader is not easy, right? You have to manage quite a complex environments and so on. So if the individual does not take feedback and then process the information and increase self-awareness and so on, then there is also potentially a derailer, right? So that's why there are certain instruments like the Hogan Development Survey talks about the so-called the dark side of leadership, right? So a lot of people are looking at usually the positive aspect, but then there are also certain aspects of personality or attributes or values that we need to be aware of.
So you mentioned about senior leaders using assessments to help individuals to become better in their roles. How effective has it been, and to what extent do you think that organization take a hard look at this feedback and actually proactively make changes? And what difference does it make to the world that we live in today? Do you think this is like the digital world, like your skills is more important? I have got the right skill, and so what if I don't have the interpersonal skills, and that you need me more than I need you, that kind of scenario? Do you feel that the world has evolved to a different need of a leadership?
Okay, so I guess it depends when we say what kind of leadership we are looking at. If you are getting someone in because of the expert power, yeah, then that makes a lot of sense, right? The person is has the expertise in a certain domain area. Then that person will be able to lead the team only for that particular purpose. But then if you're looking at someone who actually needs to develop the teams and manage the business and so on, that means that the duration is much longer. Then I guess you still need to look at the broader aspect of leadership, not just on the particular domain area that person is good at. Right? So I think that depends on the purpose objective. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could add a point to that, we do a lot of work in helping companies to deal with the future of work. Things are changing very rapidly. What we find consistently is that there are two, when it comes to people, there are two important elements: agility and resilience. You can break it down into different sub-elements, etc. Agility, how adaptable, how collaborative, how fast learning, etc. And resilience, when you fall, do you get up and and try again, etc. Right. So by and large, two major elements. If this is embedded in the people at different, even up to leadership level as well, the digital leadership, for example, how do they need to be more agile in learning? Leaders need to learn new things with technology changes, technology savvy, etc. Resilience certainly is a leadership quality, the adversity quotient, all this stuff that has been researched on, and that those are the fundamental type of attributes for leaders as well as lower down the rank.
Let me just switch gears a little because Boon Chong, you highlighted what 360 degree leadership to you means, and you talk about how important it is to work across laterally with our peers as well as managing our senior leaders, not just your direct leaders, but how senior executives view you. In a world of a matrix organization, we definitely have more than one bosses. What do you think are some of the, what are some of the tips that you have in terms of helping someone that is working in a very complex organization where you have more than one bosses? How do you deal with that? Do you have any tips to share?
First of all, organizations are structured in such a way that allows that creative tension, right? The classic of sales organization versus manufacturing versus R&D, etc. They all have different, their primary objectives are very different. Is that creative tension that comes about? Yes, historically, there has been horizontal moves using project organization, process, orientation, matrix, network, etc. But on the fundamental basis is about people working together, whatever that structural configuration is. We all know the saying, strategy drives structure and culture is strategy for breakfast anytime. I believe that's from Peter Drucker. Coming back to the people working together. So responding to your question, dealing with peers or multiple bosses. Peers, let's say you have a functional head, you have your peers are all from different functions, they are experts in different areas. How do we deal with them? Yes, there are formal channels to deal with some of these conflicts, but certainly people-to-people interaction is going to be a lot more effective. Culture is better than the structural solution. I would say that put aside your own expertise when you're talking to your peers. Try to understand the other person's point of view. Agree on a set of common goals or criteria to assess the decisions or the solutions, principle or objectives, etc. So we are all trying to aim for certain things. We put aside our own respective expertise and try to come up with the best solutions. Multiple bosses, likewise, they might be from different areas, etc.
Yeah, well said. Thanks, Boon Chong. I thought what you just mentioned about putting yourself aside your expertise, it really goes back to the self-awareness piece as well. So it's kind of interrelated. So thanks for that. Prof, do you have anything to add to that?
I guess for me coming from Nanyang Business School, we are pretty strong in the area of cultural intelligence research. So when I look at this area of studies, it actually kind of sync quite well on scenario like I just mentioned, when you have multiple bosses, right? Not just one or two, but sometimes you may have even three. And also not just bosses, but also peers from across different departments, geographies, and so on. So I think increasingly, whether you are mid-level or senior level executive, developing this cultural intelligence is actually quite critical. And if we unpack cultural intelligence, it comprises of four critical dimension. The first dimension is on actually motivation. In other words, do you even have the interest or the motivation to learn about others' culture perspective, right? And then the second one is cognitive, that means the knowledge, right? The basic knowledge about how people celebrate their festivals and so on. And then the third one is what we call the metacognitions. That means almost like self-awareness, checking for your personal knowledge and awareness. So it's kind of self-check. And then the last one is actually the behavior. That means, do you actually, after learning all these things, do you take the first step to interact with others, your behavior demonstrations? So when you actually able to demonstrate cultural intelligence, certainly that will put you in a much better positions to influence and engage others to support your organization objective.
What about in terms of managing bosses? Is there any best practices that you've seen, like really high potential individuals that has being successful in their career movement. I am sure part of the success that they have is how they manage upwards as well. Any tips?
Okay. Maybe I'll just, my short answer to that is that there's no shortcut. You need to kind of constantly interact with your supervisor, your boss, to understand his or her priorities, the pain points, as well as expectations and so on. That's one. And then secondly, I would just say that it requires time to accumulate and develop social capital. It is not just simply a transactional kind of relationship, but also over time develop that social capital. The underlying the underlying objective of social capital is that favor exchange, right? Because at times you will feel that you need support from your supervisor because you simply don't have the bandwidth to do certain things. And you need his or her favor to allow you to be excused from certain things, right? But in return, you know, when you are less stressful and so on, then you need to put in more effort to support his or her work and so on. So this kind of thing, I think, is about the individual and the supervisor, whether they have that kind of mutual trust environment, safe environment for them to bring this kind of discussion on the table. And not assume that, you know, just based on the KPI set for you, and then at the end of the year, I review your KPI and so on. That would be the worst approach in terms of building that good relationship with the supervisor.
Yeah, that's interesting. Boon Chong, do you have anything, any observations from all the advice that you have given to organization, especially when, you know, in restructuring, and then you see people eyeing for one role, at, you know, in the whole change process? What usually happens, and on who gets the job?
Yeah, well, I think my pet list would be, the first one is deliver on your commitment, always, which also means that do not overcommit. I think certainly with the speed of change and at workplace today, there are many initiatives running all the time. And sometimes you own an initiative and that the priority has changed, that's okay. But if you sign up for something that is still relevant, be sure not to brush it away and chase something else which is more fashionable at a different point in time. Sometimes in heavily matrix organizations that people get away from not fulfilling their commitment because of multiple bosses, all these things about collaboration, etc. But just imagine any leader who needs to solve a problem and they're counting on a person to solve that problem, and that sort of goes away, the loop is not closed. The memory could be pretty long. I think Nigel talks about that as well in terms of there are things that if you need to ask for forgiveness, etc., you need to close the loop, not leave it hanging there. Sometimes I just see too many people raising hands for hot initiatives, achieving very little outcome, especially in modern organizations today. I think the second point I have is that to add value, you need to bring new perspective to the table because the problems we're dealing with are not the same as before. And to acquire new initiatives, one would need to work across border, interact with other departments or even outside the organizations itself. As we all know, innovations come from intersecting points or the white spaces, etc. I think what I'm coming down to is very much talking about empowerment, empowering with new perspective, but at the same time, you need to have accountabilities. My observation is very much the companies are very good at empowering, getting people to give new ideas, raise their hands for new initiatives, etc., encouraging a lot of collaboration. They could do better in terms of ensuring accountabilities. So if a person who can do both, bring new perspectives, as well as take accountability for whatever the person commits to, I think the person will stand out It's a long-winded way to answer your question.
Oh, not at all. I actually took down a ton of notes. I felt that whatever that both of you just mentioned, let me just kind of summarize because I feel I personally benefited so much. One is how we communicate with the bosses. In a world where we have different matrix and bosses, I think it's important to make sure that we are constantly understanding our bosses' KPIs and their pinpoint. Second, Nigel brought up the social capital, how important that is accumulated over time. Boon Chong, I especially like what you mentioned about empowering with new perspective with accountability, because it's very easy to just kind of raise your hand very quickly just when you get excited, but then the ability to follow through and be accountable to deliver what you promised to do is what is essential to build your credibility over time. So it's kind of interrelated, but I feel like these three key points are things that is going to help our professionals, especially people in the organization trying to think about their next career move. Thank you so much for sharing. Just before we go to the audience's Q&A, maybe I'll just look, just one more question. I think we alluded to the to what we have just said about how do we manage bosses. Do you think bosses use any of these assessment tools to actually measure people? Like, do they actually use the observations too far to make a decision whether to promote someone, or do they use the assessment tools to promote someone? And when we always hear about people being promoted based on potential, how do you even assess potential? Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because we hear a lot of that in organizations.
Sure. Well, before I joined the academic, I used to work in consulting firm that do a lot of assessment work. So I can certainly say something about this area. I guess when we talk about, first of all, when supervisor or bosses use assessment tool, I'm sure organization, they already have some form of assessment, right? It could be the performance appraisal. It could be the boss themselves have a certain criteria, right? Sometimes can be explicit, but sometimes can be implicit, right? So those are one aspect. But if you are talking about potential, I think it's really important organization have a common understanding or a common language what potential means in this organization. And the same so-called potential may not be able to be so-called pop over to another organization because of the different context. Shell, for example, have their criteria. I'm sure Aon also have their own criteria and so on. But from some of the researchers in this field, like Morgan McCall, David Tay, and so on, they actually found that some very significant areas when I talk about potential, right? Now, of course, some people will say that performance, right? Isn't performance one of the important criteria? Yes, you can say that the past performance track record, they are important reference point, but they will never be a guarantee that the person can be successful in the future, right? While performance is important, but they should not be solely, or let's say 80% of the key decision point, right? In ascertaining a person's potential. So there are areas such as, when it comes to potential, things like the leadership promise. So what do you mean by leadership promise is that whether the person really even have the motivation to lead others. I mean, it's very difficult to put the person in a leadership position when the person is simply not interested, right? So it's the leadership promise. And then secondly is the personal development. And this is something very similar to what I just mentioned about whether the individual is receptive to feedback. Especially at the young executive level, if you notice that person is very averse to feedback, I think it's a very dangerous red flag, a red sign, right? And we have to be very cautious that, because as the person progresses further into more senior positions, when you don't listen to feedback, then the mistake that you made, the impact will be greater, right? So the personal development orientation is important. Then the third one is the alignment of values. Every organization will have a certain corporate values they want employees to adhere, and also for leaders to promote and so on. So for the individual, if he or she does not believe in certain corporate values, then whether is this the right leader for you to put the person in the more senior position, right? And the last one is the what we call mastery of complexity. So in other words, whether the individual is able to deal with ambiguity and able to have very strong conceptual thinking. Because as you move to a more senior positions, you are bombarded with a lot of information. And if you are one that is very risk averse and you do not make decision until you have all the information, sorry, and that's the real world requires to deal with whatever information you have, right? So you have to quickly make a decision, and that's where that requires a very strong conceptual thinking and able to deal with ambiguity. So I would say these are the 4 very critical so-called criteria to assess potential.
I think those are all very good points. If I could add on to some of that, I would see performance as almost the baseline. You got to pass that baseline before you be considered for promotion, and promotion would be based on the potential. If not, then we would get into the Peter's principle. If we keep promoting people based on good performance, at some point they are not performing, that's where they get stuck. Then the question would be just like what we're discussing here, how do we assess potential? I think I would see the potential as more universally across, and coming back to what I said about agility and resilience, how do we measure agility? In general, they're defined as how fast the person learn and adapt. Resilience, I talked about, and how the person overcome obstacles, adversity quotient, etc. It's required at different levels of the organization. And in large organization, people will have the flexible pathways for technical career development, managerial development. But even on the technical path, you don't get into people management that much. You still require agility. The technical skills change very rapidly. You still require resilience. How do you deal with problems, etc. And we see that very much the sort of a basic elements that we need to measure that. Just to add another point, which is what Nigel also talked about, what we would call the cognitive skills. For people to have potential to grow, things are getting more complex as you move up the organization. You need to have certain cognitive ability, whether it's conceptual, strategic thinking, or what have you. So it's not just about the soft stuff, agility and resilience, but there needs to be some cognitive ability. We just released a COVID-19 pandemic survey, future of work, and interestingly, 84% of the companies in Singapore said that the agility and resilience is very important for them, for their workforces, while only about 34% said that they have an agile and resilient workforce. So it's a long way to go. And how do we grow agility and resilience, even way back at schools, how we start that throughout the career stages.
Thank you very much. Lots of tips there in terms of how we think about developing agility, resilience, and how important that is especially in pandemic times, and the cognitive skills. And Nigel touched a little bit more about the various 5 points in terms of the leadership promise, personal development, alignment of values, and the management of complexity. So I'm just gonna take time to go to some of the questions coming from the audience. Let me just take a look at. Okay, we have a question here, which I think Boon Chong, you talked about earlier in your opening. The question around 360 degrees leadership, very much feedback from the bosses downwards, peer or suppliers? What about further out of the organization? For example, the customers or global leaders, for example, the CEOs, meaning externally, like what you mentioned earlier, Boon Chong, that as a person rise through different portfolio, and when you become a very senior person, a CEO, sometimes is even assessed by the stakeholders as well and by external media on how he's being viewed. So can you kindly provide more insight around how social media platform, how individuals could actually, based on what we believe to be important, what are some of the global trends that CEOs can do to work with social media platform?
Yeah, that's there's a double-edged sword, isn't it? The social media information in the social media, and then using it as a part of the assessment. I think LinkedIn would be in a better position to talk about that. But before that, certainly I think that comes back to what Nigel talked about, the stakeholder management. Who are the stakeholders that are relevant? If I look at the question here, customers definitely. For our type of job, we get customer feedback as well. We just need to do it in a way that it doesn't overburden the customers. Net Promoter Score, I think it's very commonly adopted. We do that with our customers. The government reps, etc. It depends on the stakeholders you are interacting with. It certainly is relevant. It's not just the few that I mentioned earlier. Social media, when we do people analytics, assessment, etc., certainly there's a view also look at what is being said about the person in the social media. It's a tricky area. We get into privacy area, etc. The information is out there. That also comes back to maybe what we talked about earlier. The basic foundation is how one manages self. So how each one of us manage ourselves in the social media, we need to be mindful as well.
Yeah. Nigel, I heard you talk about some examples of how CEOs hasn't been able to manage their external front or their external brand that has strong repercussions. Can you tell us a little bit more and give us some examples of what some CEOs has done really well and examples of CEOs that has done not quite a good job?
Well, if we are talking about good example, positive role model, sure I can think of the NBS CEO. I mean, since he came on board in 2009, he's been very passionate about bringing DBS into a digital transformation journey. And since then, you can really literally see how DBS has actually won international accolade for getting the World Best Digital Bank Award consecutive years, right? So CEO who actually go out and paint a vision, the actions, the words, the consistency are certainly very important. And then, with that strategy, kind of drive down the entire organizations and so on. Then, of course, you also have the negative kind of examples where I guess one I can think of is the Uber CEO, and this is public knowledge, right? So why he has to be removed is because of the toxic culture that he kind of built over the years, right? Ignoring some of those sexual harassment kind of complaints from employees and so on. So it also goes to show that if the CEO are not careful with social media, any kind of negative news will quickly escalate and explode, right? And it's very difficult to take it back or control or recover, right? So those will be things that we need to be careful. But maybe let me just jump back to the question about the 360 tools. we certainly have to be careful when we deploy 360 feedback tool, whether we actually get customer feedback, supplier feedback, and so on. I think we have to be fair to the feedback receiver, whether the person do interact regularly with these people to get an accurate feedback. I mean, sometimes it's very difficult for a feedback provider to ask for feedback to someone that you hardly interact with, right? And then the person will just kind of anyhow complete the bubbles, and it will not be accurate and objective. Yeah. So I think we also have to be sensitive in terms of who we select for the feedback.
Mm.
Sorry, Nigel mentioned about DBS previous group. If I could just add a point, I hope it's relevant here. I had the opportunity to sit down one-on-one interview him. I think it's about 1.5 years or 2 years ago. So I asked him what is key to him in terms of leadership. He said humility, and humility to him means that the being able to say that I don't know all the answers. I need to have smart people around me who knows more about certain things than I do, and I'm not invincible, etc. And could you imagine? I think, as Nigel said, this is a very highly accomplished CEO, and to him, humility is the key ingredient in good leadership.
Well, that's so true, actually. Speaking of him, I had the chance to also interview him. I remember him taking the 360 degrees feedback very seriously as well. So he's definitely a role model for many of us. I have the next question on speaking of the tests and assessment tools. How are organizations assessing desired behaviors, especially during recruitment, to make sure to measure role and culture fit? And how successful are these measures, meaning the psychometric tests and individual and organization performance? Have you seen that being rolled out successfully?
Yeah, okay. Maybe this question from I guess from those who are trained in industrial psychology field, will know very well assessment center is probably one of those intervention that is more valid in terms of predicting future performance. And if you only use, for example, interview, right, then you probably have a lot more misses, right? So I guess if I kind of address this in a more succinct way, then it's that it's always best to deploy a wide range of assessment methods. Don't just rely on, let's say, one personality test or just one interview or just one role play and so on. You actually have to have a combination of all this. And each of these actually are more suitable for a certain dimension, right? So for example, if you want to assess communication skill, you certainly do not want to do a questionnaire, right? You put the person, in the situation where you need the person to present, right? So I think you have to kind of work out what do you want to assess in the first place, right? Your criteria, and then from the criteria, work out what methods, what assessment method do you want to use to kind of able to give you a more accurate information about the candidate. And now, of course, the more criteria you have, the poor candidate will probably have to spend longer hours, probably sometimes 1-2 days, in kind of what we call assessment center. And the person also, it may also bring in unnecessary bias to the assessment. That means the fatigue may kick in, right? So we have to balance it well. Yeah.
If I could add to that, because this certainly is an interest area for me, a part of our business is an assessment. I would just add to it to say that yes, we use multiple tools, etc. I think the movement is towards online assessment. That pretty much propelled by the working from home, etc. But there's always been that direction. Online assessment, video assessment, etc. There's so much AI built into assessment tools that you can look at how the person react on screen, etc. You can come up with certain evaluation. Now, behind that is also the big data. Certainly to make some decision based on the short online test, that runs a risk of validity, reliability, etc. That's where the big data comes in. With big data, with AI, I think that's why we're going to be seeing very much more use of assessment tools in a very reliable and valid way.
I will just add one caveat to this about using technology for assessment. I think there are already some research shown that the use of AI in making hiring decision, there's also a potential risk of introducing bias to the machine decisions, because the machine decisions actually is built on the human decisions, right? So if the human decision for the past, all the data has been already been biased against, let's say, the certain gender or certain biodata, then the machine may actually magnify these biases manifold, right? So we also need to make sure we revalidate what the machine have decided based on the candidate's input. Yeah.
I'm sure.
Exactly, and I think the designers of the tools will need to be. There will always be need for expertise, human expertise beyond just automation. How do we develop the algorithm, refine, etc.
I believe so. As in all instances, we just have to keep on refining to make sure that it's an improved version all the time. So I have a question here, and it seems to be coming up quite a bit, and love to really get your feedback as well. Would you think that there's a dilemma being open to feedback plus mentally agile, meaning agility, versus having strong conviction to your values and ethical principles? What are the trade-offs? So for example, if whether you are seen as open to feedback and demonstrating agility, however, you feel like there are certain strong conviction that you have about how things should be done. How do you balance that?
Well, I think when it comes to values and ethics, that's a bit I think those are like the core to a person. If it's something that is against your values, against your ethics, one needs to speak out on that. Then one needs to also do it in a organizationally aware manner. You know the politics in organization, how you navigate it. If it's something which is very severe, I think sometimes we just need to walk. If it's totally inconsistent with what the person stands for. And a lot of times the feedback is more about the behaviors and styles, etc. Those are the things which are more malleable. Values and ethics is very hard to change. But having said that, I believe one of the characteristics of a good leader in today's environment is to be able to ask very difficult questions, challenge certain things, as what we saw in some of the technology company employees, how they stood up for human rights, etc. So in this environment, it's no longer just about just being very agreeable, being harmonious. You ask very difficult questions, but we need to ask it in a very considerate way. We need to be sensitive to the recipient, and we also need to do it in a very accountable manner, not just raising it and walk away. We need to try to find the solutions.
Thanks for that. I thought that was very well said. I do think that earlier in my career, I remember a book that I read. I believe it was John Maxwell, actually. He said about decide your values early. The rest is about then you don't have to keep on deciding because your values are established early, so that you are just allocating your energy to what needs to get done. So I thought that was powerful, because if your values is established very clear, then you know what you need to do.
May I just add on to this point, because I think there are two ways to look at this. If the so-called the value conflicts, now assume in this case the individual have a very strong ethics and and positive values, right? And then the leader somehow go against that. So the question I will ask is that, is it coming from one leader, or is a collective kind of senior leaders kind of negative, so-called negative values that they embrace? If it is only coming from one leader, I think then that's where the policy must be there, right? That's why nowadays company encourage the whistleblowing policy, right? And if the company does not have it, then as a employee, you should ask for it, right? Ask the company, why don't we have a whistleblowing policy? Because that's kind of a norm nowadays, right? But if it's a latter, that means it's a collective group of senior leaders who promote that kind of very toxic cultures and so on. Then it's the question whether do you want to stay on in this kind of organization?
Yeah.
I mean, after all, you have a choice, right? So, so I think that will be my response.
That's true. I have another question, and I know this is seems to be coming up quite a fair bit in the matrix organization. Any advice for professionals and people in this audience that feel like they many at times have two different bosses that have different or conflicting priorities between them, and you are trapped in between? What's your advice?
Ask them to talk to each other. Sorry, I'm just thinking that. But I think my organization is a project. We work by project, so it's that kind of matrixing networking is always there. I think leaders need to set the tone to say that we shouldn't put the person below getting conflicting messages. It should be sorted out by the leaders. I know it's easier said than done. It comes back to the quality of the leaders one has. But I think the organization need to reinforce that. If there's conflicting views, the leaders need to resolve it and then give one message to the person who needs to execute it, rather than have the person to figure out how to balance it.
Yeah. I was reminded, if I may add, I was reminded about something that we practice in LinkedIn a lot. It's what we call the RAPID framework. It's a framework that everyone in the organization is encouraged to be very clear about in making decisions and priorities. It's what we call the RAPID, meaning that R stands for recommendation, A stands for agree, P stands for perform, I stands for input, and D stands for decision. So who has the decision right is all very clearly established. Who sits in this framework, a RAPID framework, and if the organization is very clear who is the ultimate decision and who needs to agree, who do what, and the task is very clearly, the roles and responsibilities are clear, it would actually make the person that feels that they are trapped in between much easier. At least personally for me, I've used that many a times to get clarity.
And I think your peer company, Netflix, is well known that in a town hall, if somebody asks to say who is accountable for this thing, there's one person who raised their hand and say, I'm accountable. Sometimes an empowered organization sort of run wild, and then you might have 10 people raising their hand, they're accountable. There might be more of a reflection of confusion. So
it's true.
The tool can help to get to that kind of a clear accountability, but the culture needs to be there as well.
Yes, that's true. Well, I'm just gonna take one last question. I feel like there's so many questions actually, so I'm just gonna have to choose one that I feel like is being asked a few times. I work in a very hierarchical world, and I'm speaking as a third person right now, and my boss does not allow me to seek help. Seeking your boss becomes dangerous. How then do you, how can you get your communication across in such a close work culture? Any advice?
Yeah, I guess this is about power distance, right? Whether you're working in society or culture, or even an organization where hierarchy is highly emphasized, right? Then certainly you have to be very sensitive not to bring the issue by bypassing your supervisor directly to his or her boss, right? then you're not showing your boss the due respect. But of course, if you feel that the issue is really because of your immediate supervisor, who kind of like the person that kind of bring that challenge to you, and whether there is such a platform that you and the supervisor actually can have such a discussion. And if really you do not, there's no mutual trust, the environment is not safe, do you have a HR business partner that you can turn to before you bring such a matter to the person's, I mean, your boss, right? If you do that, I believe it's usually something rather serious. It may even be something of ethical kind of nature. So therefore, really, HR business partner will be a good person to do so.
Thank you for the tips.
Yeah.
John, anything that you want to add?
Well, I was just thinking about the, a lot of companies implemented employee engagement survey. So it's an anonymous way of surfacing the feedback from bottom up in a very safe way. So a lot of companies use this as a way to sort of develop better leaders and improve the culture, etc.
Yeah. So one last question. In this COVID situation, and many of the people has actually been working very long hours, workload is kind of increasing. And despite the fact that there is a 360-degree feedback, but nothing is being put in place to make things better. Any advice?
So I'm trying to understand the question better. So I suppose the person who asked this question is saying that this only happened recently because of COVID and working from home. I read between the line, it seems to suggest that there are more work rather than less work.
Maybe let me paraphrase. Basically, this person is saying, how else can we best manage if my consistent feedback is not being addressed? So for example, there's growing conflict. There's been a lot of workload and it's just been made worse now with even more work right now.
To be honest, I don't think I have an immediate answer to this because this every company and individual situation is quite different. So it's whether, again, going back, whether the organization have that kind of channel open for employees to share that kind of the challenges that they face. So for example, in our universities, when we are also asked to work from home and so on, but we actually have now my division, my supervisor actually organized like a fortnightly, we call it big elite gathering. So basically it's to see how we are coping in terms of the online teaching and so on. Then to share with each other some of the tips and how to actually reduce. Because sometimes learning alone can be very frustrating. And when we have this kind of gathering, it's very useful. It shortens our learning curve. And certainly the workload increased, that's for sure. Then it's a question of whether you have that regular conversation with your supervisor, and he or she will help you, right? If you need help, then they're able to bring some additional resources.
Mun Chong, any tips from you?
Yeah, I certainly agree. I think the people managers need to have a lot more interaction, and then, as Nigel said, also share across. I would just add one thing is we see a lot more pulse survey being done as opposed to an annual employee engagement survey. It's also another way to get more feedback more frequently. All this is assuming there's a will to do it. If there's no willingness to do it, I think we need to talk about different solutions.
I'm just kind of reminded of earlier when both of you mentioned about culture fit and the values of the organization that needs to be aligned. If you feel like this is something that is very important to you and you have given consistent feedback, and then the question then is to ask whether there's alignment in terms of culture with the organization as well. So I thought it's valuable to kind of bring back some of the things that both the gentlemen had brought up very earlier on in the conversation. All right, we are near to the end of time, but before we go, maybe I can invite Boon Chong. Any last piece of advice for the people here, for the professionals, and any last piece of your career advice for them?
Yeah, well, I think probably not different from what I've said. It's more of what you are doing now. We need to do it very well at the same time as with the eyes open to what is required. And it's almost like the apply well at the same time as learn because what we know today could be obsolete tomorrow, and it can become obsolete very fast, as a matter of fact. And so keep an open mind, continuous learning, all these things. Singapore spends a lot of money on retraining, upgrading, etc. That is all good, but it all comes back down to we have the agility, the resilience to be able, with those additional training, we will be able to cope with the future. So how do we develop the agility and the resilience? That's probably more important than saying that I go for this training for the future skills today.
Thank you. Prof Nigel, any last tips?
Ditto, I guess, very similar to what Boon Chong mentioned. Certainly is to embrace a lifelong learning kind of a mindset, especially when it comes to leadership. Leadership is a journey, and you need to kind of remain open to explore. Certainly, you can't say that I have arrived at leadership just by attending a certain course and so on, right? And like what Boon Chong mentioned as well, the external environment change. So we also need to constantly adjust and adapt our leadership style, right, based on the environment we're in. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much for all the tips. Nigel, on your last tips about leadership being a journey, I'm just reminded that it's a bit like a parent as well. I'm like thinking that, am I going to be the best parent ever? It is still a journey too. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I hope you had a wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Goodbye, everyone.